My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual talk, The Just and Good Governor of the World, John Hancock's Congregationalist Roots and Religious Commitment with Dr. Jeffrey M. Griffith. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, in the place in the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and sermons and manuscripts, as well as our digital archive with more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, church members, or really anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. I invite you to please check out our website to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. So in 2024, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts chose Dr. Jeffrey M. Griffith as the editor for their multi-volume Papers of John Hancock project. This is a little mind-blowing, folks, right? To date, there had been no comprehensive collection of Hancock's writings that had been curated. And this is a problem, as you're going to hear from Dr. Griffith, because his papers were scattered between distant relatives, mainly because Hancock didn't have any surviving direct descendants. In order to assemble the over 4,000 letters that span across 4 decades, which are found in 80 archives, repositories, and collections across North America and Europe, Dr. Griffiths had to do a lot of work. So you're going to hear today about the early fruits of this project. The multi-volume Papers of John Hancock, along with their accompanying website, seeks to really overcome this fragmented reality of Hancock's correspondence, providing a kind of centralized resource for his writings and discussions with numerous historical figures on countless subjects. So please let me introduce the motivating force behind this project. Dr. Jeffrey M. Griffith wrote his dissertation on Massachusetts election sermons from 1763 to 1793. And in that work, he studied how ministers used the annual tradition to interpret the events that pushed Massachusetts from a loyal colony to a free and independent commonwealth. You're going to hear a lot more today about why Hancock, and I want to encourage you to explore this fantastic online resource, the John Hancock Papers, published by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts at johnhancockpapers.com. Jeffrey, thanks so much for being with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to sharing with everyone Hancock's Congregationalist roots and religious commitments. So, of course, when we think of John Hancock, the immediate idea that comes is the Declaration of Independence. So, in addition to just signing the Declaration of Independence, first and boldly, he had to distribute the information to each of the states. So he wrote essentially a form letter to all 13 now independent states. And he wrote to the states, although it is not possible to foresee the consequence of human actions, yet it is nevertheless a duty we owe ourselves and posterity in all our public councils to decide the best manner we are able, and to entrust the event to that being who controls both causes and events so as to bring about his own determination. So to each, in the very first paragraph, when he's announcing how Congress declared the colonies free and independent as now states, he invokes religious terminology for the underlining rationale for that. So in addition to writing to the states, he also wrote to personal friends and fellow merchants. And he writes to William Cooper, who's a merchant in Boston. He says, could you exactly know my particular situation and how much of the day and night I devote to the execution of public business, I'm confident you and my friends would readily excuse my not writing. I'm really so greatly engaged in business fast and increasing in my department that I have not a moment to myself. My friendship, however, is so strong, my zeal as great, and my reliance under God that my country will be saved as firm as ever. I hope we shall be a free and happy people. So both publicly and privately, he's connecting current events to his religious understanding. So, of course, while he's known foremost for signing the Declaration of Independence, his influences and activity span much greater time frame. So, as Kyle described, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts has named me the editor and the curator for assembling the papers of John Hancock. As Kyle mentioned, the papers were scattered across numerous distant relatives, collectors of autograph, of his famous signature. And so the idea is to curate it all back into one central location. There's going to be multiple volumes, at least 7. We'll see how many more are needed on that. And we'll include over 4,000 letters from over 80 archives and collections. So the manuscripts themselves span from a 1754 letter that Hancock wrote as a senior at Harvard to his sister, to 1793. The last letter that he wrote that I've currently discovered is to Samuel Adams. And each entry is going to have a full transcription, footnotes with historical context, and then in the back of each published volume, there's going to be an index, a thematic index that's going to help guide researchers to specific themes and individuals. So while that process is occurring with the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, I've created a companion website so researchers can access the thousands of letters, all while they're being printed in physical form. So far on the johnhancockpapers.com, I currently have 3,105 letters uploaded. And you can see the remarkable span on the bottom. 1754 to 63 has 22 letters. 64 to 73 has over 580. And then just showing the sheer workload, especially as president of the Continental Congress, that he had. 1774 to 1783, 3,100 letters are just from that period of the total over 4,000. And then just currently over 300 for 1784 to 93. So one of the parts of goal of the project is to show Hancock's continual influences and contributions, as well as putting it in conversation with wider historical changes and events. So here, there's an interactive timeline on the website where from 1754 to 1793, there's events for Hancock and there's historical events at the same time that shows what's going on in both aspects. And one of the most exciting aspects of the website is this private AI system that I've developed. So with it being private, what that means is that it's continually being trained on the data that's within the website system. So as letters are uploaded, as footnotes are added, and as questions are asked, it continually learns and can provide more thorough answers and connect researchers an entry point into different various subjects. So we'll keep circling back to that AI throughout this talk. So right now, this is a screenshot of the search options on the website. So right now you can see, so with the 3,105 letters on the bottom left, that are uploaded right now. There's from 65 different document sources. And then over 450 authors wrote to Hancock, and he wrote to over 380 people. So it's a very expansive, web of influence that he has going on. And you can see, under author, right now I have 258 letters written from George Washington to Hancock, and 186 letters that he wrote to George Washington among all the others. So there's 3 ways to view each entry of letters on the website. You can look solely at the transcript, you can look solely at the document, or you can this is a side-by-side view of where you can compare the transcript on the left and the photo or the image of the document when it's in the public domain or I've received permission to use it on the right here. Additionally, what the goal is for this project is to not just have the letter there, but on the bottom left, you can see to access the collection catalog for Baker Library at Harvard University is to promote each libraries, archives, collections, their individual collection. So it provides an access point for researchers to then explore collections that might be outside the scope of my project, but allows an idea of where to search for further resources. So with all that as an entry point and using the website and information to build this talk, there's 3 broad types of religious engagement that Hancock participated in. So his family roots, his father, grandfather, and uncle were all Congregational ministers. And then later on in life, as Hancock sought to rise in politics, he used these family roots to legitimize himself in society and in the public's eyes. Another major group or another major aspect is the benefactions and donations he gave to various congregations, meeting houses, and communities. And this activity was modeled by his Uncle Thomas and Aunt Lydia. And then John, as his own perspective, provided bells, land, money, and his resources to it. And then, particularly as a political leader, he tapped into Massachusetts religious traditions. So days of Thanksgiving and days of fasting were annual observance days that he promoted. These are answers when you use my private AI to be able to use as an entry point. The way a question asked, especially as it continues to be trained, influences how the answer comes out. So, like my first question, did John Hancock interact with religious figures? It mentions his stepfather, Reverend Daniel Perkins, and then mentions that his family has a background on it, mentions his father and grandfather as ministers. And then the bottom one, did John Hancock have a relationship with reverends? It mentions other reverends outside of his family that he interacted with. And then another key feature is that on the left, you can see the sources. Those are the letters that were pulled in by the AI to create that summary. And those can be clicked on to take you right to the letter, where you can then see the transcript, the image, or side by side. So with that as an entry point, his congregational roots, his grandfather's Bishop John Hancock in Lexington, Massachusetts, served there for decades. His father was Reverend John Hancock, became the Reverend in Braintree. And then his uncle, Ebenezer Hancock, became the junior minister for the Governor John Hancock's grandfather in Lexington. So the Hancock family publications, Bishop John Hancock had 3 sons. Like I mentioned, John became the minister in Braintree. Ebenezer became the junior minister in Lexington. But the middle son, Thomas, became an indentured servant in 1718 at the age of 15 to Samuel Garish as a bookbinder. As Thomas worked through the ranks, he became, a printer in his own right, and then expanded that much more as a transatlantic merchant. So Bishop John Hancock, Governor John Hancock's grandfather, delivered the ordination sermons for both of his sons who became ministers. And Thomas Hancock printed both of those sermons in pamphlet form for it. So the whole family was involved in their religious activity at this stage. So unfortunately, John Hancock's father in Braintree passed away in 1744 when John was only 7 years old. And the governor's and the future governor's first appearance in the published historical record occurs in the pamphlet or during the sermon for his father. And you can see on the third paragraph of this page here that he's alluded to alongside his sister Mary and brother Ebenezer during Ebenezer Gay's funeral sermon during the funeral sermon. And it says, when we behold the dear and tender offspring of the departed servant of the Lord, do not our bowels yearn over them, to think how good a father they have lost, how solicitous and skillful a guide of their youth. But with God the fatherless find mercy, and men will surely show kindness unto these for their father's sake. May they all be spared, and there be a blessing in every one of them. So the future governor's first appearance in the printed historical record is as an orphan, essentially, of what would be considered an orphan in 18th century society. So from that point, John Hancock's aunt and uncle adopt him. He goes to Harvard, he takes over the merchant empire from his uncle, becomes leader of the provincial Congress, president of the Continental Congress. And as Massachusetts is trying to pass a constitution, which initially fails and then finally passed in 1780, Hancock's starting to look for ways to rise politically within Massachusetts. And this, the pseudonymous author in the June 12, 1777 edition of the Independent Chronicle uses Hancock's roots as a way to legitimize his social standing. And so, it sought to show how honorably our patriot was descended. His grandfather was held in the highest repute among ministers, and then his father nearly resembled the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then at the very bottom, you can see thus honorably was our patriot descended. It is true, he had not the blood of all the princes of Europe running through his veins, as Dr. South said of Charles I. But he has blood that is much better, blood that was never stained with popery nor arbitrary principles. Long live the hero, and may the amiable temper of his pious father be more and more conspicuous in him. So prays a friend to him and his country. So as Hancock was transitioning from a continental stage back to now what became the Commonwealth of Massachusetts stage, one way that he and his allies believed that he could rise in ranks was to emphasize his religious roots in society. So another way that he made aware of his place in society through religion was through his various benefactions and donations. And again, through the AI, how he expressed his support for meeting houses by offering financial contributions. So the letter that's cited here in particular is that letter we saw side by side earlier on the website from 1787 about how it mentions how he's fond about promoting, and establishing the gospel in towns throughout New England. So Thomas and Lydia, his uncle and aunt, modeled the behavior. And in that same article that we just read of him touting his religious route or his religious roots, the author also wrote that Thomas held one of the best estates in Columbia and was one of the greatest benefactors to our college, with the idea that now John is promoting and continuing the same behavior and activity. So one of the interesting exhortations that the family received was that during the funeral sermon for John Hancock's grandfather in 1752, Reverend Nathaniel Appleton directed comments directly towards the Uncle Thomas Hancock. And he says, "May the only surviving son of this family be distinguished as much by the riches of divine grace as he is by the bounties of providence. As he is rich in this world, may he be rich in faith. May he be directed and assisted in all his acts of piety, charity, and Christian liberality, that this may procure to him a name better than that of sons or daughters, even an everlasting name." So it's an interesting postulation, idea, or visual to imagine that John Hancock was sitting very close to Thomas as Thomas was being encouraged to use his success and resources for God's kingdom, basically. And these acts by both the Uncle Thomas and Aunt Lydia are highlighted in their final will and testaments. So for Thomas in 1764, he gave £1,000 into the society for propagating Christian knowledge among the Indians, £100 to Brattle Street Church, and £100 to the deacons to use for benevolence funds, provided communion table elements, and £200 for Reverend Samuel Cooper for a suit of mourning, because apparently you got to look good for these funeral sermons for that. And then for Lydia, the aunt, when she died in 1776, she focused on ministers' wives and daughters in addition to them. She repeated the gifts to Battle Street and the deacons. And then her house that her mother used to live in, she donated so the eldest minister, could live in for that. So she provided property on there. So Thomas and Lydia often fulfilled operating needs. Like they loved communion tables, communion elements, and that was often their major gifts. John, on the other hand, had a very widespread, ostentatious perspective. So he funded congregations throughout New England, Massachusetts, and Maine, New Hampshire. And his favorite was donating bells. In 1767, he donated a bell of 300 weight. In 1768, he donated a bell of 700 weight. So good size bells. The bells, for numerous reasons of how he associated that with being home in Boston while he was in Philadelphia. He writes to Thomas Cushing in April 1776. He says, "You say nothing of Boston. I want to hear everything stirring there. Pray are the bells taken from the steeples. I long to hear the sound of those bells. Do give me all particulars." So one of the main case studies that we can observe of John Hancock's extensive benefactions to religious communities was 1772, when Battle Street was seeking to build an elegant church. Hancock used his vast, beautifully vertically integrated business operations, his wharf, his ship, his contacts, in England, to provide the materials. That he himself donated £1,000, and it was promoted in the newspapers as his benevolence, as a reflection of his benevolence and public spirit. So this even got talked privately within the circles within Boston. So merchant John Andrews wrote to John Adams in 1772 that Hancock suffers nobody to outdo him in acts of public utility. So this initial act got him notoriety for it. But in addition to just seeking notoriety, he also put in tremendous amount of work, especially as tensions with England were escalating. So he would write to his trading partners in England about very detailed dimensions, quality, colors, everything of the quality of glass that he wanted imported for Brattle Street. And then, things are heating up with England. Boston Tea Party occurs on here. December 10th, just as all this is spurring around and about to occur, he hastily writes to his trading partners, Haley and Hopkins, to ask for the bell, the pulpit furniture, the curtain to be sent. And then even despite, just as the Boston Port Bill's passing, things are shutting down, things are imminently about to change. His last ship from England arrives, and it has this massive 2,700 weight bell on it. And at least 5 newspapers mentioned this generous present that Hancock gave. So as his business is about to change dramatically, he ensured that the religious community got what they needed, that he promised to them. So the final large overview theme is the religious traditions. So does John Hancock mention fasting? He mentions it, and we'll talk about this, June 26, 1775, fasting. And then how I mentioned that this is a private AI and there's no outside influences that it can pull from. It has to be in it. So the bottom ones, how you can see promote a reconciliation between Great Britain and the American colonies. As I'm able to add more letters from the 1780s, that answer, which is accurate for what it has, will further adjust to promote Massachusetts as a commonwealth, not just the pre-declaration, goals of a day of fasting. So days of fasting and prayer, they date back to the earliest settlement days of Massachusetts. They were used to bolster a united identity. The announcements and rationale were disseminated through newspapers and broadsides. And then for Hancock in particular, it provides good, regular insight into how he interpreted current events, and then particularly through a religious lens. So one of his first days of fasting was as the president of the Provincial Congress on February 16, 1775. So that he wrote, "It has pleased Almighty God, the just and good governor of the world," which is the title of our talk today, "to permit so great a calamity to befall us as the present controversy between Great Britain and these colonies, and which threaten us with the evils of war." So the idea was to atone for sins, ask for reconciliation, ask for peace, and plead for that. Well, a few months later, things haven't calmed down. The olive branch petition was denied. It was gonna kick up. War was imminent. And a week before the Continental Army formed, and George Washington was named the commander-in-chief, John Hancock, as president of the Continental Congress, urged inhabitants of all the English colonies on this continent to observe a day of fasting and atonement for sins. And he hoped that a speedy end may be put to civil discord between Great Britain and the American colonies without further effusion of blood. So, there were these attempts of praying for peace. There was the political route for the olive branch petition, but of course, neither one, we eventually led to war. And when he did another day of fasting on May 17, 17, the wartime reality of the period was emphasized and encouraged. And not only was, all the inhabitants of the English colonies on this continent were encouraged to observe it. He specifically urged Christians of all denominations across the continent to participate. And he desired to please the Lord of hosts, the God of armies, to animate our officers and soldiers with invincible fortitude to guard and protect them in the day of battle, and to crown the continental arms by sea and land with victory and success. So what was desired now, which, this is still a couple months before the Declaration of Independence, was recognizing the current situation they were in. So whereas the day of fastings occurred, there were also days of Thanksgiving that focused on the blessings and goodness of the period. And his first official religious day of observance as a political leader occurred as the head of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. So on October 22nd, 1774, as delegates are in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress for the united effort, he praised the union which so remarkably prevails, not only in this province, but through the continent at this alarming crisis. So this pattern continued as he was a political leader. So he became governor in 1780 under the Commonwealth's new constitution. And then in the specific intervals, observed days of fasting and days of Thanksgiving. And for each one, he would write out a proclamation of why each day was necessary and what the hope was for that day of observance. And then in a fascinating connection, when Hancock passed away in 1793, the Columbian Sentinel was the first newspaper to announce his death. This came at the end of that issue because it had just occurred on there. And the notice came at the end of the issue. However, on the front page of that article, or of the October 9th edition of the Columbian Sentinel, was the proclamation for the annual day of Thanksgiving for 1793. And in that, Hancock wrote why to be thankful. And he praised God for protecting the Commonwealth from a smallpox outbreak that was going on, and from drought. And then he reflected upon the revolution they had all gone through and put it through a religious lens. And he wrote, while bloodshed and devastation have attended the struggle for the rights of man in Europe, it should remind us of his remarkable appearance in our favor when we were contending on the same principles and for the same important purposes. So when he did pass away, Peter Thatcher, who was the minister of Brattle Street, the new minister or the current minister, did a funeral sermon, because everything goes back to a funeral sermon in basically these topics. Provided a funeral sermon for the sitting governor. And in it, he described how Hancock felt himself interested in everything that related to the house of God. Further, touting his legacy, Thatcher noted how Hancock inherited from his ancient ancestors a great affection for this religious society, and he exceeded them in his acts of liberality about it, promoting his religious roots, both within the family and then his direct line, and then his aunt and uncle. And then regarding the benefactions, the sacred desk from which I now speak, yonder bell which calls us to the house of God, it announces our return to the house appointed for all living. The volume from which the sacred scriptures are read were exclusive donations from him. So much of Brattle Street that the congregation was currently enjoying were fruits of Hancock's generosity and religious devotion. So as a conclusion, across 5 decades, John Hancock emerged from an orphan in print to the pinnacle of religious, political, and social standing. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And the questions are rolling in, which is very exciting. Let me start with one that kind of came to my mind. Jeffrey, you've probably looked at more Hancock letters than most other folks out there in doing this project. How many Hancocks, I guess, are there? Is there a public John Hancock and a private John Hancock? Is he always the same person? And does he always feel comfortable talking religiously with all of them, I guess?
So it's really interesting. So Hancock typically enjoys being at the pinnacle of whatever group he's in, whether he's hosting a dinner, whether he's in the best pew at the church, whether he's the head of government for that. So there is that elevated status that he enjoys. The fascinating insight is the second oldest letter that I found so far. It's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Is to Harvard student he went to Harvard with, a person he went to Harvard with. And this is in December 1754 for it. And it's one of the few times where he's talking to a friend as equals, and he provides an update on all their classmates on it. But to answer the question further, has fun when he's writing a personal letter compared to an official letter. The tone is different. He likes talking about his friends and all that for that. So there is that element to it. So, but the fun part is through all this chaos, not knowing what the future held, like we can project, even me making that comment about this is a couple months away from the Declaration of Independence. He didn't know that at the time type thing, is that there's a sense of humor that underlines, their relationships on it. So at Revolutionary Spaces, they have a hymnal of his that Hancock owned. And on the inside cover, he wrote, "Thou shalt not steal, saith the Lord, John Hancock." Like basically, don't end up with this hymnal of mine, but he does it in a humorous way for that. So there's a mix of, it's not always somber or serious and all that like you can imagine. I mean, who knows who was around them when like someone say, "Oh yeah, what if someone steals your hymnals?" Like, well, watch this. So yeah, so there is good human insight into that. Yeah.
And always wonderful, right? With these figures who we learn about in school and who historians have written about, to realize that there is a human side, right? That they are not
Exactly.
just kind of, Greek gods, if you will.
Yes.
I guess I would have to ask as a follow-up question, did he always sign his name with a giant flourish, or did that come later in life?
So there's fascinating work to be done on that. And so I would encourage people, go look at the letter to his sister Mary from 1754, because it's the earliest letter of his to exist, and his signature evolves over the year. So you can see there at the very bottom, John Hancock, just this, by his standards, humble signature on there. And the way that it's fascinating seeing his signature evolve, because when he goes to England in 1760, there's a letter from December 1760 and a letter from January 1761, and his signature changes right there in that 1 month's time. And then that paraph with the flare underneath was used by his uncle. And when John took over the company, he adopted that paraph as well. And then added the H in the middle. But there's a good study to be done on his signature for that.
You heard it here, folks. That's a project to jump into.
Yeah.
Rick Taylor, a great friend of the CLA, asks, So how would you explain his reputation as a smuggler with his religious interests? Is there a conflict there, or?
I mean, it's an interesting insight looking back now, how that could be rationalized, in the period, because the short answer would say, no, enough, there's not a problem with that back then because enough people did it, on there. And it was well, so I'll go back to the same conversation when the goods for Brattle Street came in.
Mhm.
Technically, the ports were closed then, but he likely used his own the wharf that he owned to get this ship in and got not just whatever was Brattle Street for Brattle Street there, but his oil, his goods, his imported items. Like technically that act in a legal sense, that act itself is smuggling right there because the ports were essentially closed at that point. And then you saw it in the funeral sermon, Peter Thatcher praising the gifts and generosity that are technically smuggled goods on it. So it's one of those where that's ask for forgiveness thing, I suppose, but he probably wasn't asking for that in the first place. So
Or maybe to use the term that we use today, he was a complicated individual.
yes, yeah, yes. Well, it's one of those, he was complicated, and there wasn't time in this talk about it, but he had a huge falling out with Brattle Street in the final years of his life, where there's a question of where did he attend the last few years of his life?
Hmm.
Because he was looking to sell his pew at Brattle Street on it. That was a whole nother angle to take on it. But there's interesting tension in that funeral sermon for him in 1793 for that. So yeah.
Great. Another great research question.
Yes.
Erica Avina asks, and this is a couple other questions that come up too. Can you explain your use of the term bishop as it applied to the grandfather?
Yeah. So
Congregate.
yeah. So that's one of the great quirks of the Bishop John Hancock of him there is that it wasn't an official title like in a denominational sense, but at Lexington History Museums, that's widely known as his title because he influenced and did ordination sermons for so many ministers that he gave the seal of approval that he was basically the quote unquote bishop of the ministers in the region. And the line they would give at Lexington History Museums is that, they literally went against almost like they put him as a hierarchy in a non-hierarchical denomination, that like it's a term of endearment rather than a formal religious title. And then even, I saw a comment about the use of reverend in there too. Like that is a bit more of a more modern take on how to label them. But we've got 3 generations of John Hancock and we've got to label them somehow. But no, so the bishop, yes, is very anti-congregational, but it's a term of endearment that's been attached to him for that. It would be interesting because I mean, kind of thinking on the fly, I don't believe that term bishop is used in that funeral sermon in 1752 for him, but I don't know him well enough to know, was it applied real time to him or how did it get applied for himself? That's for that, but it was a phrase or was a phrase used. So for that.
Thank you. Question here from our good friend Lauren Hughes out at the American Antiquarian Society. So Lauren asks, a question regarding your scope of work on the Hancock papers. Are you also looking for letters written by Hancock that were reprinted in newspapers? Since his correspondence was so scattered, could there be letters that are no longer extant in the archive, but that do survive in the newspapers?
There are. So the first letter that I cited for the Declaration of Independence, that one that was pictured is in the Massachusetts archives the one he wrote to the Massachusetts Assembly. I found the North Carolina one is in a newspaper, and there's a letter it's later in 1776 in there that was published in the New York Times that I haven't found where it is. That it says it's in a private collection, and someone was, it's like it might have been for the centennial in 1870s was printed. So there are a handful that are in newspapers that we don't know where the original, or I haven't found the original. And then similar answer, a little bit different. New York State Archives had a massive fire in 1911 and destroyed a bunch of their Revolutionary era material. So we got to rely on their printed journals from the 19th century that transcribed them, because most of the originals were lost, unfortunately. So to kind of build on that same point.
But I think what's really important about your work is that you very clearly identify where the source is for it, that somebody using that could know this is a 19th century copy versus this.
Correct. So correct. So like both for the newspaper, because that would be public domain, and then the journals from New York, and Peter Force's work, American Archives and all that. It's clearly cited and then like Peter Force modernized by 19th century standards spellings, and so you just know those details, to bring that insight into things. So yeah.
So here's another question. I love this one. I hadn't made this connection, but I'm curious what you think. So Charlie Hambrick Stowe, another great friend of the library, says the catchy and appropriate title of this session, "The Just and Good Governor of the World," sounds almost more Masonic than traditionally Christian or Puritan/Congregational. Hancock, we know, was a Mason, as were many of the founding fathers. So what might be said about the complementarity, or on the other side, the tension between Masonic theology and philosophy and Puritan Congregational Reform theology?
Sure. So it's because another phrase he uses, and it was in one of the letters too, is the controller of all events for that as well. And it's interesting because Hancock was a man of action type thing. So it would be fascinating, because he'll write mainly to his wife that I heard this excellent sermon today, but he doesn't go where, if this was John Adams, he'd go on for 4 pages on why it was an excellent sermon. But it's interesting. It would be fascinating to have more insight on Hancock's theological thinking on that. But he does use his go-to phrases are controller of events, good, our title here, but all that for that. So it does seem like he taps more into the Mason roots than the Congregational roots. I mean, and is that, this is more idea of speculation or idea on here. Is that because he wasn't necessarily raised in a minister's household? He was raised in a merchant's household for that, and went to Brattle Street type thing, which would be Congregational, but he wasn't, he didn't have enough time to get that Congregational theology put in him type thing. So, yeah.
I'm going to group a couple questions here about the women in John Hancock's life. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about, so his mother did outlive the father, right? And I think you mentioned maybe she got remarried. So there's a question from John Anderson about the letters between John Hancock and his mother, Mary. And then there's another question from an anonymous attendee about if you've been able to uncover any new letters to his wife, Dolly, that had not previously been published, or any letters from his wife. So
it's really fascinating. So his mom was married 3 times, every time to a minister. John Hancock, the father, was her second husband, and all 3 of her kids were through him. So they're full siblings. And then she married Daniel Perkins in Bridgewater afterwards. after that, who was a minister as well. So it's interesting. There's hints that he wrote to her, but I haven't found any surviving letters directly from John Hancock to his mother. But when he's in England, there he writes to Daniel Perkins, his stepfather, basically to his mother, but he has to use his stepfather as the conduit, basically. So there's 2 or 3 letters to Daniel Perkins that are essentially letters to his mom, but he addresses it to his stepfather. There are a group, something again I didn't have time to talk about in this. John Hancock's brother Ebenezer was going to Harvard to become a minister. And then the Uncle Thomas guy in his ear turned him into a merchant. And there's letters from the mom to Ebenezer where she is not happy about the decision. They're fabulous letters. Regarding Dorothy, finding letters that she wrote to him is a huge goal of mine. I haven't found any. The Dorothy Hancock homestead doesn't know of any. I mean, I've asked her, I found mentions in Hancock's letter of a handful she wrote to him, but he wished for more letters. Regarding letters from him to her, there's this fascinating trend that I'm noticing, but haven't delved into too much. It would be like, there'd be a group of letters from, say, Thomas Cushing to Hancock, and there'd be a group of 5 of them that would be donated somewhere, and a letter from John Hancock to his wife. Then there'd be a group of letters, say, to Captain John Bradford that were donated to another place, and a letter from John Hancock to his wife. So it's almost like each descendant got a letter that John wrote to his wife, and then they scattered on there, because I found them in several different, and all throughout the country as well on it. And so there have been several that have never been printed before on it. And and to go back, so the more general, have I found letters that haven't been published? That letter that I cited about the yearning to hear the bells in Boston, that letter was actually sold through an auction house and has never been in library collections before. So that's a new addition to what can be researched, and I found it through an auction. I spent a weekend digging through auction archives of numerous auction houses and came across that one. So there are new neat discoveries like that.
That is fantastic. And, without your work, we wouldn't be able to kind of surface those in one place. It feels fitting as a final question, and I am going to send to you all the questions because we're not going to be able to have time to get to all of them. We are fast approaching a day of Thanksgiving. And Dr. Pamela Ehrlich asks, thank you, Dr. Griffith. Did any other founders proclaim days of Thanksgiving and or of fasting? Or is Hancock alone?
So when James Bowdoin became the second governor, he continued for that 3 years in between. He did them as well as a Massachusetts tradition. And then it was a tradition of, when Hutchinson was it, when Francis Bernard, that they did days of Thanksgiving as well. So it was a political tradition to do those days. But what I think is unique about Hancock, and there was no precedent for it, is when he was in Philadelphia as president of the Continental Congress, he did it on a continental scale. He expanded a Massachusetts, New England tradition all the way down, up and down the coast. So that's his contribution of expanding it, is that he, obviously believed in the importance of it enough to believe that it could serve some purpose, as a direct benediction, as a uniting effort that, just like that plea for success during war, that's a uniting effort. And he called Christians of all denominations to participate in this as a unifying effort. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, I think I speak for all of us in the virtual audience that we wish you luck as you continue this project. You know that you have our gratitude for doing this. I hope everybody will go out and check out johnhancockpapers.com. It's a fantastic site. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for this work. Take care, everyone.